I can see, oh, 47 participants. 47 participants. That is why we can start. Dear guests, dear students, dear alumni, dear colleagues, dear professors, I would like to warmly, very warmly welcome all of you to Shining a Light on Energy, 10 years of the Lisbon Treaty Conference, organized at the College of Europe at Natolin. I am at least at Natolin, but others are online. But welcome to the conference organized by Natolin. First of all, I would like to thank our students from the Natolin Energy and Climate Society, who are initiators and co-organizers of the conference today. And special thanks to Alex Green, to its chairwoman. At the same time, the words of my gratitude should go and are sent to the conference scientific committee, composed of the College of Europe professors, and its chairwoman, Professor Anna Herans Surales. Anna, thank you very much for your contribution and for your hard work. At the same time, I would like to thank our development staff within the administration, Dr. Barbara Bobrowicz and Ambassador Lorkowski, for their support and contribution. As we know at Natolin, we have been teaching energy and climate-related subjects for years. And we are very proud to say that from one year to another, we have more and more students who are interested in these subjects and whose master theses are more and more focused on climate and energy. We are very proud at Natolin of observing the extracurricular activities organized by the students, not only by our society, but also by others. However, this Natolin Energy and Climate Society plays a leading role in organizing all extracurricular activities. And this today conference is the result of this. It was intensive year. It was intensive work in a very difficult year. However, we have succeeded and we can meet and we can discuss. Our students have successfully attracted an impressive range of speakers, of participants to debate and to discuss their findings. I trust that the panels taking place over the next 2 days will give rise to reflections on both the achievements and shortcomings of the decades-long inclusion of energy in the Lisbon Treaty. Perhaps more importantly, this will also be a space to look forward and reimagine realities as we increase our efforts to tackle the problem of climate change. For somebody who took part in the negotiations of the Lisbon Treaty, it is a source of satisfaction, and I would like to thank everybody for that. Having been with all those people who were fighting for inclusion, energy policy to the Lisbon Treaty, as I said, it's a source of satisfaction for me. I would like to say that our dreams to create the common energy policy were not, didn't come true, but we can continue this discussion. I hope that you all enjoy taking part in this conference. While today I cannot enjoy the privilege of welcoming you in person to the beauty of the Natolin campus, but I hope to do so some day in the near future, since the energy and climate subjects will be discussed at Natolin during the next weeks, months, and years. Thank you very much for your participation, and I would like to ask Anna or Alex to continue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Vice Rector, and a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Scientific Committee, which I had the pleasure to join together with other professors teaching on energy-related issues at the college in Natolin, and whom we'll also will see later on today and tomorrow, as several of them will take part as moderators of the sessions. The Scientific Committee was involved in providing some advice on the topic of the conference, and also in helping during the quite competitive selection procedure for the papers to be presented in this panel. But I have to say that our role was rather modest, and also a very comfortable one, since the Energy and Climate Society at the college, but also the team there with Ambassador Lorkovsky and Dr. Bobrovich did an excellent job in putting all this together. So thank you very much for all the effort and for making this event come true. My role today is to briefly introduce the topic of this conference on EU energy policy 10 years after Lisbon. For those of us who teach EU politics, or who have studied EU politics, it is quite normal to associate treaty reforms with the birth of new policies. If we think, for example, of the Single European Act in the 80s, besides the single market, provided the legal basis for environmental policy, for a cohesion policy. Then came Maastricht, naturally linked to the monetary union and the common foreign and security policy, Amsterdam to justice and home affairs, Nice to defense. And the last treaty in this succession, the Lisbon Treaty, will always remain linked to the birth of EU energy policy, at least as a policy in its own right, and not as an appendix of other policy areas. So it was really a step forward, a step that injected a new dynamism in EU energy policy that later on gave place to the Energy Union Initiative in 2015, which the Vice President of the Commission back then, Maros Šefčovič, qualified as the biggest initiative after the European Coal and Steel Community. 10 years after Lisbon, and what 10 years, I may come back to this later, it is very timely and pertinent to rise on what has been the impact of this legal recognition of energy into the treaties. And in so doing, I think that the contributions of this conference will highlight at least two main questions, two main threats that are the most important, and I would like to highlight those. The first common aspect that all the contributions of this conference will have is the goal of discussing to what extent and how EU member states, the EU institutions, citizens, and other stakeholders have made use of the possibilities introduced by the Lisbon Treaty. Because, to use the very English expression, EU treaties are a bit like buying a pig in a poke, which means that you never know what you will get. And this is because treaties are notoriously ambiguous, but we could say that rightly so, because treaties need to provide the necessary flexibility to adapt to any unforeseen circumstances. But it is also this ambiguity that generates sometimes tensions, conflicts of authority, and a certain uncertainty of what are the limits of EU competence. So this will be explored in depth in the coming 2 days. For example, the first panel today, we will deal, for example, with what are the legal and practical consequences of introducing the solidarity principle in Article 194. This principle seemed initially only a symbolic addition, but has recently started having some teeth. or how to interpret the famous paragraph 2 of Article 194, establishing the right of member states to determine their own energy mix in a context where most of the EU interventions do directly or indirectly affect this right. Also tomorrow, a lot of the contributions will deal with the governance of the Energy Union, which has also given a lot of debates about what is then the actual role of the EU member states and the Commission in this new governance mechanism, or what are the consequences of the formal recognition of renewable energy communities in EU secondary law. But of course, beyond these institutional issues, the second aspect that the papers of this conference are also very interested about is how we can make energy transitions work, and to make this fast enough to prevent at least the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. And here the political context and economic context after the Treaty of Lisbon in these 10 years has not always been a big help, because the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty coincided with a major economic crisis after the global financial downturn. And 10 years on, it seems that we are coming full circle with another looming economic crisis, this time caused by the still ongoing and uncertain COVID-19 pandemic. So these are challenging situations because economic crises sometimes distract from other distant but potentially more severe crises such as climate change. But at the same time, as a political scientist would say, major crises do also provide the policy windows to try to, in this case, rebuild the economy on a more sustainable footing. So the contributions of this conference will all engage with these challenges and opportunities. So we will hear presentations on as crucial aspects as whether the energy governance regulation for renewables is fit for the purpose, to what extent climate litigation can be a solution to make governments abide by their own commitments in reducing emissions. Can financial institutions, for example, the European Central Bank, be greened? Can we make decentralized energy systems more resilient? Or how can we square the energy transition with social justice? So in sum, I think we have an excellent lineup of presentations ahead of us today and tomorrow. As the Vice Rector mentioned, it would have been delightful to have the chance to meet in Natolin and to continue our discussions while strolling through the magnificent campus, maybe with the visit of a wild deer. But will not be the case. But at the same time, this online format, I think that also enables other people who could, who may not have been able to make it to Warsaw, to also join in. So this conference is not only, it's not just a second best. It is a new opportunity to engage in this lively debate among experts and students and around Europe and also beyond. So I would like to finish thanking again the college for hosting this event, the Energy and Climate Society for all the effort and excellent organization, and to all the presenters, the rest of the students of the Hannah Arendt promotion, and all of you in the audience for keeping up the spirit of engagement in these rather stressful and still challenging times. So thanks again. And I would now like to pass the floor to one of the students closely involved in the organization of this conference, Alexandra Blim, whom I think will experiment a little bit with us, putting some questions for the audience. So please, all the best for the next 2 days, and thanks again.
Dear Anna, this Vice Rector, thank you very much for your words, your very kind words. It has been a great project to work on over the year. And I was delighted to be the president of the society with such an event to organize and with such a nice person to work with. As I said, here we have a group of students in Natolin that are very much into energy and climate issues. And throughout the year, we put together many events, among which today's conference. The Natolin Energy Conference, entitled Shining a Light on Energy, 10 Years of Lisbon Treaty, aims at discussing the achievements and challenges of the last 10 years in terms of EU energy policies, as well as looking towards the future in terms of potential developments within this field. The European project saw the European Community for Coal and Steel as an early symbol of the new Europe. However, energy has been placed under national primacy for a long time. The period of the 19th corresponds to the enhancing of the Europeanization of energy policy. Energy had to wait until Lisbon Treaty with the Article 194 to be introduced in European primary law. Over the 2 decades, energy and climate policy have greatly evolved before further deepening this during one and half day of conference. I would like together today to quickly go through these evolutions. And for that, it might be an easy, or what seems to be an easy question, but is not. I would like to elaborate on 4 main institutional and policy change over the last 2 decades. The first of which is actually our conference topic, which is the introduction of energy in the European primary law within the Lisbon Treaty. Competences defined by the treaty enable a polity, so a political authority, to take legally binding measures. By inserting the new title 21, Energy, in the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, confers to the EU an express competence to take legally binding measures, even though it's limited by important reserve for member states. As I said, energy is a matter of national sovereignty as well. So the Article 194, which is the only one in the title Energy, underlines 3 goals for the European energy policy: security of supply, competitiveness, and sustainability. Always pictured as a triangle, this was already conceived in 2006 in the EU Green Paper, a strategy for sustainable, competitive, and secure energy. And since then, it has gained a quasi-religious stature. The first thing that didn't wait for the Lisbon Treaty to happen was the establishment of an internal energy market with 3 main packages, and recently the Clean Energy Package. The lawmaker didn't wait because before the Lisbon Treaty, there was the Maastricht Treaty, which involved the 4 freedom, free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor within the EU. This pushed for a series of 3 consecutive liberalization packages. There was the condition, a sine qua non condition, to establish the internal market for gas and electricity. But the EU didn't push member states to unbundle their energy system just for the sake of creating a market. This was needed. This well-integrated market came along with the crisis of supply management and the establishment of energy targets. In 2008, the EU decided these ambitious 2020 goals, which involve a lot more renewables over the decades, and that are more needed today. Therefore, a strong European grid was needed to send surplus energy from one corner of Europe to another, cover deficits. Those across country, cooperation aroused to plan the European grid together over the 10-year network development plan, or coordinate operation with common tools such as network codes. And that's a great sign of the European integration. And now if we take a step further and more close to us, the governance regulation as part of the energy for all, the clean energy package for all European. As I just said, the EU set up ambitious goal for 2020, but also for 2030. And it was needed to be able to monitor the progress of these goals. So the governance has two important elements. The first one is the climate monitoring mechanism. It updates the existing climate monitoring mechanism, bringing in line with the transparency requirements of the Paris Agreement, which is also a milestone in the energy and climate policy, impacting us Europeans and everybody worldwide. The second very important element of this governance regulation is the national energy and climate plans. This must be in line with the overall European Commission energy and climate ambitions. Today, the Commission is reviewing them, and with the COVID-19 pandemic, it was the question whether they should be adapted or not. But it is unlikely. On the contrary, the recovery plan offered by the Commission is seen as a tool to help the implementation of these national energy climate plans. The last, but definitely not the least point that I would like to mention today, and that will drive us towards the end of our conference tomorrow, is the European Green Deal and the commitment to climate neutrality. This is the new challenge Europeans decided to undertake. The Green Deal and the climate law are symbols for an update institutional settings. They show the ambition of the new Commission to make climate and sustainability overarching theme. 2015 has been a turning point. In the same year, the EU adopted the Energy Union strategy with a strong focus on security of supply following the annexation of Crimea. But it also commits to the Paris Agreement, aiming at limiting our green gas emissions. While 10 years ago, energy policy was about market integration, today it focuses on our need to decarbonize our economy. Not only the energy sector has to be decarbonized, but also transportation, buildings. The Green New Deal is therefore a set of consistent measures across sector to address climate change, with the objective of reaching net zero greenhouse gases emission by 2050. The challenges of the EU energy policymaker were facing when the energy was added in the first time in the energy within an European treaty have evolved very much. The will of a just transition, just energy and climate transition for European citizens bring new challenges that need policy replies. I hope that this 1.5-day conference on the 10 years of energy in the Lisbon Treaty will provide you with a good understanding of the achievement, the challenges of the last 10 years, and the years to come in terms of EU energy policy and climate policy. I wish you all a very fruitful conference. Once again, many thanks to all of you for joining us already for this opening session. And now I warmly invite you to join us for the first panel that will follow right after, and that is on EU energy sovereignty and solidarity. Thank you all, and see you on Zoom many times, I hope.
policy. And we will be happy, of course, in this panel to switch the light on, as suggested by the name of the conference. We will discuss a topic which has been a classic in both energy policy and also international politics for centuries, essentially, and that is energy sovereignty. In a multilateral political order, the obvious question is, whose sovereignty are we actually talking about? And this is a question that has been answered by the EU from its very first days, essentially. It is, the European integration is based on sharing, so of giving up sovereignty over energy matters, in this case of coal, from day one, from the days of the coal and steel community. And now under a geopolitical commission led by Mrs. von der Leyen, this whole issue of energy sovereignty makes a big comeback, but evidently on the side of the European Union. You could ask in Macronian terms, do we have strategic autonomy in terms of energy as Europe? And you could probably, if you were to answer that question, you could become quite pessimistic, especially looking at recent news about threats of sanctions by the United States on infrastructure projects in Europe, and whether this is actually a sign of lack of our strategic energy autonomy is something for everybody by themselves to answer. But I think this is part, personally, I see this as part of our European malaise, as through the looking glass of energy policy, evidently. We're talking here, and we're talking also when we look at Article 194 that was so nicely introduced by Alexandra in the opening session. We are talking about member states' energy sovereignty. It was reflected, this desire to keep an energy sovereignty or to keep sovereignty over topics such as energy was reflected in a bad manner, I must say, in a formula compromise in Article 194 in the debate on whose competence is energy policy actually. And it was and the question so badly answered as also the concept of energy sovereignty is illusionary in the 21st century and probably already quite some time before. We're living in a globalized world, we're living in a world of interdependence, and we're also living and experiencing and actually implementing an energy policy which is supposed to perform much more and achieve much more than just sovereignty matters. And I'm thinking, of course, here of fighting climate change in the first place. And so it's maybe not a surprise that we have seen over the years melting this concept of national energy sovereignty like ice in the sunshine. And you can observe that by following the different streams and developments of European energy policy. It started probably already in the 60s, 70s with the development of European environmental policy, which put thresholds related to air quality. And if we go back to our original EU fuel, coal, then I think this becomes quite evident how national energy sovereignty, this illusionary concept, already was reduced in a first step by environmental norms. Then evidently we got a market, a European energy market in which different fuels compete. So again, if you would want to claim that a country has a sovereignty over deciding on whether it would like to deploy and employ and use coal as an electricity fuel, for example, the market in which it competes, this fuel competes with much cheaper renewables, is again a part of slicing away of national energy sovereignty. And then it goes further. Then we have targets in the wake, but also anticipating already the Paris Agreement, which promote different fuels, and that goes European-wide. We also have now a carbon price in Europe, which affects the choice and the sovereignty of energy. So this makes all a country's claim to have and enjoy sovereignty over its energy mix a rather theoretical concept, I would say. But of course, it is about how our panel will see that today. And I note that when looking at the presentations and the papers behind them, that indeed we will mostly look into this idea of an erosion of national energy sovereignty. We will look at its limits from different perspectives and in different manners. We'll have a first presentation on the principle of solidarity, which implies that you give away something of your own sovereignty in order to support others. We'll have then a presentation on the European Commission recommendations in the context of the national energy and climate plans, and to what extent that limits national energy sovereignty or sovereignty over the energy mix. And we'll conclude by a presentation on the famous 550-gram rules applied in the context of capacity mechanism. All these are very, not only very interesting topics and presentations in themselves, but I believe they will indeed shed a light on where today in 2020 we can still claim that the sovereignty over a country's energy mix is something that is not only rooted in Article 194, but also a practical reality. And with this, I'm happy to give the floor to our first panelist, that is Eva Mazur. Welcome, Eva. You are not only an alumna of Natolin, but also a European law and energy policy expert at the Ministry of Climate in Poland. And that is, I believe, not just a coincidence, because the principle of solidarity, which is also embedded in Article 194, is a legal seedling, if you want so, which was planted by the very same country that has invented Solidarność, and it has been brought to life. It has been woken up also by a judgment which was initiated by Poland against the European Commission. Just as a footnote, and maybe to bring in my own home country into this, I know that the Referendaire who wrote the judgment was actually a German, but it's not about the authorship here. It is indeed what I have sometimes considered a Costa Enel moment for European energy law, and I'm very interested in how Eva sees the development. Please, Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor, for this introduction and for passing me the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. As my time is very limited, I will share my presentation with you and get started. So as already introduced, the topic of my presentation is energy solidarity since Lisbon, from paper exercise to constitutional principle. This is how my paper is entitled. But in this presentation, I will focus on the characteristics and implications of this principle. First of all, a general remark is needed. The notion of solidarity is present in the European project from its very conception. And what is also very important in this light is that until energy solidarity entered the Treaty of Lisbon, the notion of solidarity is present in the European European discourse, mainly in the context of recurring energy crisis. It entered the Lisbon Treaty thanks to the policy entrepreneurship of the, at that time, new member states, led by Poland, and makes multiple appearances in the treaties. But I will focus on the one from Article 194, which also sets the basis for the energy policy. To cut it short, all four objectives of the EU energy policy have to be pursued, according to this article, in a spirit of solidarity between member states. But what does this mysterious clause of of a spirit actually mean? Is it a political idea of a merely declaratory nature, or is it a legal criterion from which rights and obligations can arise? Then, is energy solidarity should energy solidarity be applied only in the crisis situations, or is it a principle of general application that should be followed in every action undertaken by the EU and the member states? To answer these questions, I made in my paper a comparative analysis of Article 194, which led me to a conclusion that this provision is actually a special expression of the general principle of loyal cooperation from Article 4, Para 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. When compared to other crisis and energy crisis related articles of the treaty, one has to realize at some point that 194 cannot be limited to crisis situations only, because otherwise it would constitute nothing but a duplication of the solutions that are already in place. Therefore, I claim in my paper that it is a guiding principle which has to be applied in the exercise of the competences in the energy field, rather than occasionally as an exceptional measure. However, for last 10 years, this obligation to act in a spirit of solidarity remained undefined. It is only the 2019 ruling of Poland versus European Commission case, where the EU General Court elaborated the definition and characteristics of energy solidarity. The court confirmed that energy solidarity is a binding legal principle and specific expression of the duty of sincere cooperation. It used this very principle as grounds for judicial review in this very case, which is very interesting because this is the very first moment when this long undervalued principle becomes actually a legal ground for annulment of the decision of the Commission. As a consequence of the annulment, the regulatory regime of the OPAL gas pipeline changed. OPAL is the gas pipeline that it is actually a terrestrial section of the Nord Stream pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany and then all along the German eastern border. And for this reason, I will refer to this case as to the OPAL case. Most importantly, the court elaborated a definition of energy solidarity that was missing for so long. It is an obligation on the part of the EU and the member states to avoid adopting measures liable to affect their interests and to take account of their interdependence and de facto solidarity. But what does it mean to take measures, avoid taking measures that are liable to affect the interests of other member states? The interests of member states can always be divergent, and they are very often clashing. Well, the court made it clear that the application of this principle does not mean that EU energy policy must never, under any circumstances, have negative impacts for the particular interests of a member state in the field of energy policy. To make this principle work, the General Court introduced a specific energy solidarity test, according to which EU institutions and the member states are obliged to take into account, in the context of the implementation of energy policy, the interests of both EU and the various member states, and to balance those interests where there is a conflict. This principle has to be applied, therefore, by means of balancing exercise, which is not an easy task. And we know it from such principles as subsidiarity or proportionality. The ruling raises important questions related to energy sovereignty of the member states and division of competences. Given that in the EU, the competences are divided into the EU level and member states level, a question arises whether to which sphere of competences does this principle actually apply? And the answer to this question will also let us know to what extent this energy sovereignty clause will be affected by energy solidarity. So how much the member state of their, as the professor mentioned, illusionary concept will have to give up in order to strive for common good. This will have to be answered by the courts in the future. But what is clear is that new principle increases the powers and the roles of the Commission, which is enabled and obliged to assess national decision-making in line with new principle. And this will possibly have an important impact on how the future regulatory regime will be shaped. When it comes to regulatory implications, it appears that no exemption or derogation can be granted without considering the solidarity principle and the impact on infrastructure in question on other member states. It is perfectly illustrated by the very recent decisions of the German Regulatory Authority concerning derogation procedures for Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. But as I'm running out of time, I will not elaborate in details on that. But it is the very first case when energy solidarity, after the Opal judgment, was actually applied, in my view. Let's move to the policy implications. With a proposal for concrete actions, the General Court takes energy solidarity far beyond mutual support in case of energy crisis. The rediscovery of energy solidarity is likely to inspire policy change and become a basis for climate solidarity as well. The EU's climate action, based on fair burden sharing and mutual commitments for the achievement of a common goal, already represents a form of solidarity. But what if the member states will not be willing to follow this spirit of solidarity? Then it seems that a model of selective solidarity and interpretative dilemma is left. But on the other hand, it does not seem to be a viable option, because without a truly shared European approach towards energy and climate solidarity, the achievement of climate neutrality by 2050 seems unlikely. And with this reflection leads us towards the conclusion, where I would like to highlight that energy solidarity was confirmed by the court to be a binding legal principle of EU law of a general constitutional character. It goes beyond crisis management and has far-reaching consequences. Application of the principle takes place by means of energy solidarity test. But the future of this application depends, however, at this point, on the Court of Justice of the European Union, as Germany brought an appeal against the judgment. Germany and its appeal claims that the principle is not a legal criterion, but a purely political notion, which epitomizes the problem the EU has with energy solidarity and energy sovereignty, in my view. And what is the alternative if the Opal judgment is set aside by the Court of Justice? Well, European energy policy is not and cannot be limited to the matter of solidarity only. It consists of three major components: competition that stimulates, cooperation that reinforces, and solidarity that unites. Solidarity will stay at the very heart of the EU energy policy, no matter what the Court of Justice will decide. And in any case, Further clarification from the European courts on the details of energy solidarity will be needed. To conclude, the principle calls member states to move away from energy sovereignty, which does not take account of their interdependence and de facto solidarity. Energy is therefore yet another field where a shift from national perspective to a shared one is desired. It is of utmost importance if Europe wants to face the challenge of climate change in an effective and socially acceptable way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eva, for this really beautiful and very concise and also inspiring presentation. I personally have many questions, but in the interest of time, we'll reserve them for later. And now we would move to the next participant at this panel, that is Anna Matthews. She's a lawyer at the important Polish law firm SMM Legal, and will talk about energy sovereignty and the governance regulation. Ironically, it was precisely the governance regulation, maybe the most important piece of the so-called clean energy package, which was supposed to resolve the conflict between energy sovereignty of member states on the one hand and Europe's ambitious climate goals, so European energy policy on the other hand. And the question now put to Anna is that a mission failed? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that we can attend the conference despite the atypical circumstances related to the virus. So let's start. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the Article 194 TFEU and the governance regulation. I will analyze whether the regulation, specifically the recommendations issued by the European Commission, impact the member states' energy rights from Article 194. I'm going to divide my presentation into three main parts. Firstly, I will present the most important instruments of the governance regulation. Secondly, I will talk about Article 194 and its interpretations. And finally, I will present the assessment of the recommendations of the governance regulation in the context of TFEU. The regulation was one of the proposals of the Clean Energy Package for all Europeans, commonly known as Winter Package. The governance introduces new obligations for member states in the area of energy and climate, and provides the European Commission with competences corresponding to the member states' obligations. The most controversial of these competences are recommendations. A governance mechanism established by the regulation is often referred to in the literature as an intricate system of planning, reporting, and assessment. The regulation introduces a two-level system. Member states are obliged to prepare integrated national plans and long-term strategies with a minimum 30-year perspective. The EU monitors the implementation of the plans by analyzing annual and biannual reports submitted to the EC. Integrated national energy and climate plans are prepared by member states every 10 years for a period of a decade. The first plans for a period from 2021 to 2030 had to be notified to the European Commission by the end of 2019. The regulation provides that the plans shall set out in particular the national targets, objectives, and contributions in all 5 dimensions of the Energy Union and the relevant policies and measures needed to achieve them. In the first plans, the member states identified contributions for 2030 targets concerning inter alia renewable energy sources, energy efficiency, and electricity interconnections. As you can see in practice, the plans provide detailed information on member state choices between different energy sources and the general structure of their energy supply, so-called energy mix. The procedure for approving integrated national plans consists of multiple stages. At one of these stages, the Commission may issue recommendations in respect to the draft of the plans. The EC had been made the guardian of the plans process. The Commission has at its disposal a toolbox to deal with cases of non-compliance, insufficient ambition, and insufficient progress towards the energy and climate targets and the 5 dimensions of the Energy Union. Today, I will focus on the first of these recommendations of Article 9, second paragraph of the regulation, so recommendations for the draft of integrated national plans. When reviewing the draft plans submitted by member states, the Commission may issue recommendations to states. These recommendations may concern, inter alia, contributions with a view to collectively achieving the Union's 2030 targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency. As you can see, the catalogue of these circumstances is quite broad, and the term in particular indicates an open catalogue of matters in which EC can issue recommendations. The recommendations shall be taken into account by each member states in their final version of plans. I will tell more about it later. Going to part 2 of my presentation. Article 194 TFEU addresses the issue of limits of the EU's competence in the field of energy. A. Johnston and E. Marrell indicate that the usefulness of Article 194, first paragraph TFEU as a basis for secondary legislation is curtailed by the second sentence of Article 194, second paragraph TFEU, so-called the caveat. The caveat states that EU measures shall not affect member states' right to determine the conditions for exploiting its energy resources, its choice between different energy sources, and the general structure of its energy supply. Article 194 TFEU raises a lot of doubts. As you can see, there are some positions in the legal doctrine regarding this matter. M. Nowacki, in Polish commentary to TFEU, indicates that the Union may influence the national energy mix directly and indirectly. Measures of direct nature simply shape the internal energy supply structure of individual member states through obligations to use a specific source, at least at a strict minimum level. An example is the 2009 directive on the promotion of the use of energy from renewable sources, which provisions include 2020 mandatory national targets. In turn, the indirect impact of the measures is primarily related to the EU's environmental policy, including in particular the policy on counteracting the negative effects of climate change. Going to part 3. Although recommendations are generally non-binding, the regulation introduces in Article 9, third paragraph, the obligation that each member state shall take due account of any recommendations from the Commission in its integrated national plans. Additionally, if the member state does not address a recommendation or its part, it shall provide and make public its reasons. So member states should explain how they implemented the recommendations. However, there is no specific verification process or any specific consequences of not implementing them. This will provide for many ways for member states to evade or contest recommendations. The scope of both the integrated national plans and the recommendations are quite wide. In the plans, member states describe their choices between different energy sources and the general structure of its energy supply. Consequently, the recommendations issued by the EC refer to member states' energy rights. It is not difficult to imagine a situation when member states would propose in their plans that they intend to use one energy source and to a certain extent, And then the EC would issue recommendations suggesting that the level of ambition of share of this source is too low and should be improved. According to experts, call for more and more ambitious instruments made in extremis be judged as indirect influence on member states' energy right to fully determine their national choice between different energy resources, thus surpassing Article 194, second paragraph TFEU. However, there is a formula introduced in the Annex 2 of the regulation in the area of renewable energy source that is also likely to protect member states from over-ambitious recommendations of the Commission. Unfortunately, a similar ambitious mechanism has not been introduced, example in terms of energy efficiency or other objectives, targets, and contributions in the plans. Despite the fact that the regulation introduced an obligation to take due account of recommendations, recommendations are rather a tool of political pressure. It appears that in the absence of a penalty system for failure to comply with recommendations, member states' energy rights from Article 194 can only be infringed indirectly. In consequence, the implementation of the recommendations is based on the goodwill of the member states. Article 194 raises many doubts. Also, the provisions of the regulation are often ambiguous. They both should be more explicit in order to be effective. Maybe the EU and member states should consider to either use a different legal basis for energy secondary legislation, example, the harmonization provisions from Article 114 TFEU that has clearer grounds for derogations, or amend Article 194 TFEU, as it currently raises significant doubts in regards to the autonomy of member states' energy rights. To sum up, while the treaties ensure member states' energy rights, the EC is probably seeking an increasingly strong influence on member states' energy choices. The regulation, including recommendations, does not lead to significant infringement of these rights. However, a more balanced approach in terms of influencing the rights of member states is required. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you will be able to read more about this issue in the post-conference publication. If you have any additional questions, you can also contact me via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a really interesting insight into the key piece of the clean energy package and the new way on how energy policy is conducted in this multi-layer governance regime that we have in the European Union. I'm particularly interested, maybe later in the discussion, to hear from you also an empirical feedback on the relatively critical view on that you have on recommendations, whether that is also confirmed in practice. In other words, whether the recommendation that the European Commission has been giving on national energy and climate plans made any impact or were actually suitable to change any or to instigate any changes in the energy mix. We can discuss that later, but now we will move to the third panelist, and that is Wouter van Dorpe, another lawyer in the Brussels-based law firm Fieldfisher, where he's indeed dealing with energy and utilities on a daily basis, I assume. And he will introduce us and familiarize us with the so-called 550-gram rule. I remember that was one of the biggest lobby battles in the history of European energy policy, whether that rule would be included and what precisely the threshold would be in the new electricity regulation. And the interesting thing is, because we were talking about the erosion of the concept of national energy sovereignty, that we have, we're discussing here a double blow to national energy sovereignty to the extent it ever existed. It's not only by carbon policy, but also by state aid policy, because as we all know, capacity mechanisms have to fulfill other European law tests besides their compliance with our carbon policy. I pass on the floor to Wouter. Please, Wouter, take over.
Thank you, Dirk. That's a great introduction. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you all for participating, joining this conference, and thanks for the already very interesting contributions, I think, of the previous speakers as well. And I will try to share my slides with you now. Here we go, that should work. I'd say no time for further introduction. So here are my 2 cents and contribution to the topic of the conference on solidarity versus sovereignty. First of all, I'm not here to criticize the Article 194. It's the first legal basis for a common European energy policy, and it worked. Just imagine a world without Article 194, trying to make a common policy built on joint energy plans that would be sheer impossible. And the whole clean energy package of the last years has been as a legal basis based on that Article 194. So it has shown its purpose. That is very, very clear. My question is, will it work in the future? Is it fit for purpose to implement the measures ahead, to implement what is called today the Green Deal, knowing that this Green Deal is more mixed up and more complicated than ever? All policies are intertwined. There's a big chunk of climate as a basis. There's the environmental protection issue. And there's the chunk of energy, which is incorporated in all of these legal principles. So it's not the same exercise that we need to do as we have done for the clean energy package, which was very, very streamlined and very much related to a common energy policy. Is this article also fit for purpose when more than ever energy solidarity as a principle is required, and when more and more global issues are encountered versus the maybe often political reality of trying to push more on the member state energy sovereignty? The case I want to bring forward, well, my point is that I try to show the limits of this Article 194 today. I believe it almost reached its limits already a couple of years ago, and still is troublesome in some cases. And the case sample is, as Dirk indicated, the famous 550-gram rule, which needs to be situated within the regulation, electricity market regulation 2019-943, as to capacity mechanisms. Capacity mechanisms, to put it very briefly, are state support for companies based on, say, the capacity or generation per member state or for a member state in order to improve security of supply for that member state in a member state. In other words, to keep the light on. One of the modalities of the capacity mechanism is the 550-gram rule, which has shown a lot of issues and discussion, and it's sort of a good handbook for all legal principles involved when talking about a common energy policy. This 550-gram rule is a condition that is imposed in the electricity market regulation for now and in the future, depending on the type of installation, new installation versus existing installation. It's a condition for participating in a capacity mechanism based on a maximum emission, and that is this 550 gram of CO2 of emission that needs to be respected in order to get entry in a capacity mechanism. And this, of course, factually hinders the classic or the old coal-based capacities to participate in a capacity mechanism. There's by the way, specific grandfathering clause that has a transition period for existing coal plants, of course, that is inserted. But still, the rule counts and shows a lot of issues. First of all, there's a geographical scope. If we talk about capacity mechanisms, it's less obvious that this is an EU-wide thing. It has a lot of local aspects as to state support, subsidies, as to the regulation zone often. So it is a question mark to put to the question whether it's local or completely EU-wide. While as the 550 gram rule also deals with emission limits, which is per definition global or an EU-wide thing. That's first question mark. Second issue encountered is the legal basis. Is this a measure dealing with merely energy? Is it climate related? Is environmental protection the basis? It's more doubtful, it's less clear whether or not Article 194 of the treaty is applicable or solely applicable. Or do we have to investigate whether Article 192 would also serve better in this case, or other articles as indicated by previous speakers? That's the second issue. Third issue is about the potential friction, I'd say, between this rule really intervening in, well, at least de facto intervening in the type of a capacity that you can use or that you can support, whether there's a friction with the choice of member states in order to provide your own energy mix, the so-called energy sovereignty in 194 of the treaty. So that's the third big issue that is encountered. Fourth one is about state aid rules. As we probably know, there's specific state aid rules related to energy state aid, one of which is the tech neutrality, the technology neutrality condition that you cannot distinguish on basis of technology, say gas, coal, wind, solar. The question here with the 550 gram rule, knowing that it de facto excludes coal power plants, is whether this abides with these or this technology neutrality issue, and more general with the state aid rule. So that's the fourth issue. Fifth issue, last but not least, I'd say, isn't there a big interference with already existing systems, such as the EU ETS system? Of course, there's the opinion that is often used that the reduction of emissions from coal-fired power plants will be offset by an equivalent rise in emissions from other sources or countries. Those are communicating barrels, and the question is whether there is an interference with this already existing system. To put it generally, and given the short time, there's a big complexity, and this always has impact in court cases, and with court cases I mean national court cases and ECJ court cases. And I try to sum up a bit the fight that you would or could expect when purely theoretically, of course, this 550 gram rule would be attacked or defended in court. The question is which principle would get priority in court, because that is always the discussion. And I try to put forward the principles that might play in court based on our experience, I'd say. Of course, there's a non-discrimination rule, the dogma in which you can ask, related to the 550-gram rule, whether a justified distinction is made between coal and non-coal, whether there is an inequality due to the possible double punishment, given that already there's an ETS system that sort of puts obligations and conditions towards emission limits. Of course, there's the environmental protection and climate legal principles, the reason why emission limits towards CO2 are put. And then there's the often contradictory energy principles in 194, energy solidarity and energy sovereignty, which both often serve a different case or cause. As to energy solidarity, security of supply is taken into account and the functioning of the energy market, while a sovereignty, member state sovereignty, sort of pushes this back and tries to have less interference when talking about measures such as the 550-gram rule. I think it serves as sort of a litmus test for potentially looking at Green Deal measures, and given their specificity, given their mix of policies between climate, environment, and energy. So I think, at least if I can draw some conclusions on that, at least it shows that, well, Article 194 sort of makes and creates difficulties in se, in itself, specifically if there's a mix of different policies that are also to be found in other articles in the treaty. I'm personally not sure whether this 550-gram rule would have survived in court. It's a theoretical opinion of mine, of course. It's a theoretical discussion. Given the wording of the energy sovereignty clause in 194, non-discrimination issues, and even state aid rules that might have successfully opposed against this 550-gram rule, we must keep in mind, as stated by a previous speaker, this is a political compromise. It's not a natural process of clauses and articles that join together. But it's not a hopeless story I'm making. This 550-gram rule is a positive story in se. It's one of the examples in which it is shown that for state aid, for capacity mechanism, there's also environmental rules that can be imposed or should be imposed. So that's a good thing. Another thing is as indicated before, the energy solidarity principle is on the rise since the Opel case, but I think it's not strong enough yet for all situations, for dealing with all situations. Taking into account that in the Opel case, the main argument is that no examination of the principle is done, but we still do not know what the borders of this legal principle is. And that is an interesting discussion as well. Maybe finally, well, should we wait for the next 550-gram rule case to have a really specific case on how to go further? Of course not. We're ahead of trying to make Green Deal measures. All member states are in the course of making and checking with the Commission how a capacity mechanism should look like. So my advice to governments, to just as a 2 cents, of course, is to take into account these difficulties, this interference between legal principles, and justify and motivate as much as possible how do you see this legal principle you want to impose next to other principles. I think given the limited amount of time, I will rest here, but of course I'm available for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter. This does not only bring your really excellent presentation to an end, but also, I think, a very nice bouquet on different aspects of what energy sovereignty is today and what it is not, and the complexity of implementing energy policy in a legal order such as the European Union. So I got a green light from our charming question box to ask one question to each panelist, and then we'll see whether there's more from the audience. And I start with Eva, who was talking about solidarity. I always wondered, because the Opal judgment said something along the lines that the decision makers, so the European Commission in that case, should take into account also other member states' interest. And in an energy policy as complex as it is in the European Union and beyond today, what does it actually mean, a country's interest? Is that really a mono-dimensional interest, or whose interests actually do we have to take into account? The companies, the NGOs, the population, however interests are defined. If companies, then only state-owned companies or also private ones. What if these private ones are multinational, etc., etc. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. Then a question, and I already asked it essentially to Anna as well. You essentially have been looking into the impact of Commission's recommendations on the energy sovereignty of member states. Now we know that the recommendations have replaced, let's say, a more straightforward way of influencing energy policy in member states, namely through infringement actions. Do you see that this new tool of making recommendations in how it is actually implemented in the energy and climate plan process leaves and has left a big impression on member states? And last question to Wouter. You were talking about the double punishment in the interference of the 550-gram rules with the emissions trading scheme. I was just wondering, the 550-gram rules is kind of a market entry barrier. You cannot enter into the market, a specific market, the capacity market, if you don't fulfill it, whereas the ETS applies to all participants in energy markets. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on this notion of a double punishment? And while you will ask your questions, we still have a few minutes also for the general audience to come in with theirs. Thank you.
Can I start then? Or
yes,
should we wait?
No, go ahead, Eva, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Well, it is a very good question because it reflects very well what is missing, both in the judgment and in our perception of energy solidarity, that by this judgment was very much changed, or this judgment calls for change of perception of this very principle. Well, whose interest should be taken into account? I think that at this point, as we've seen in the example that I didn't manage to introduce in more details in my presentation, so the recent decisions of the German regulatory authority on the derogation for Nord Stream 2, it seems that the way the member states will try to apply it is by simply consulting each other, because German regulatory authority decided to make a very broad consultation, which was not required by any procedure whatsoever. It was not required by the gas directive in this procedure, which was derogation. It is required to some extent in an exemption decision, but not this one. But German Bundesnetzagentur decided to consult everyone anyway. And the member states got the floor to simply present their positions. So probably it is to be up to the member states in the case-by-case application of this principle to decide what interests they want to protect. But this is, again, well, probably a practical approach, but also quite limited in a way, because as I mentioned in my conclusion, I see this judgment as a call to look from a shared perspective. This in such a interconnected, not only world, but even interconnected energy market, it is hard to imagine to decide on make important policy decisions without having an impact on the system of the neighboring member states. So I would claim first, before the courts will elaborate on more details, member states will try to simply consult each other and protect their own interests, however they perceive them. But the ultimate goal is to simply take into account the European interests, the interests of the Union and of the market, that we finally but surely will become a single market. I'm not sure if it is a satisfying response, but as we're running out of time, I will stop here.
Very elegantly answered. Thanks a lot. It's a consultation between governments, I assume, mostly. And I'm just wondering, especially when we won't talk about energy solidarity anymore, but climate solidarity, what a certain Greta Thunberg would think of that. But with that, let's pass on to Anna. Please, Anna.
I would like to underline that generally I assess the governance regulation positively. I think that it provides member states with clear rules about reporting so far distributed to other legal acts. However, I'm not sure if this regulation will be effective. Most of the obligations imposed on member states in the regulation, in particular recommendations, do not involve a strong penalty system. Hence, despite the new instruments being granted to the Commission, the EC may have difficulty enforcing appropriate action from the member states. As I said during my presentation, the implementation of recommendations and the general governance mechanism is based on the goodwill of member states. In consequence, I think that the governance regulation does not influence member states' energy rights from Article 194. There are, however, some doubts. Member states, for instance, are required to implement one of the dimensions of the energy union, decarbonization. As the name suggests, in the plans, member states should explain how they intend to give up coal. So in practice, how they intend to change their energy mix based on coal. Also, the EC can issue recommendations in that scope. So as I said during my presentation, more balanced approach is required. Unfortunately, we are short on time, so I hope that I will elaborate this issue in the post-conference publication.
Thanks a lot. And finally, Wouter.
Thank you, Dirk. The question was to elaborate a bit more on this statement of double punishment regarding to the 550 gram rule. This wording, double punishment, is used by a lobbying organization, and I was happy to take that over. But a better wording is that, or a better explanation is that one should avoid that the one system neutralizes the other system, of course. So all benefits of imposing a 550 gram rule in a capacity mechanism with the goal of limiting CO2 emissions could or can or will be neutralized by the current system as it is in the EU ETS. So these rights could be used or could be given towards another sector or another emitter in order to emit more, and that is of course not what is intended by the 550 gram rule, that you just can shift it towards another industry that can emit more. So instead of a double punishment, I'd say it's more of a warning that you should be aware that one system could wrongfully neutralize the other system while having the same goals. And in this case, it's very clear the same goal is emitting less. So I think we have the same discussion in the aviation industry. And I think it's a normal discussion. It's not something new, but we have to take that into account when considering the 550 gram rule and when considering or reconsidering the EU ETS system.
Thanks a lot, very clear. And this brings to an end a great panel, unless Borja, I think it was from the question box, would have more questions to come out of the box. In any way, I pass back to the floor back to you. And I think you'll all be migrating to the next panel soon. Normally now the internet would resonate with applause for all of you, but that's a bit difficult. Great presentation. I think this was an excellent start into what promises to be a really highly interesting and inspiring conference. Thanks to all panelists, and back to the organizers.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Wouter. There are no questions right now. We are running out of time. I'm looking forward to know what's the role of all these principles, legal principles now with the Green New Deal, that it seems that it's taking everything. So I would like to see what is happening in the next years. So I will just post the link and everything on the chat so we can connect at 4:30 to the next floor. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you after.
dedicated to the EU energy security challenges. My name is German Carboni. I'm a student at the College of Europe here in Italy, and I will just introduce a few rules that we implement in the conference to make it as participative as possible, considering also the Zoom format that we had to apply, and introduce our moderator. So in this panel, we're going to, of course, just explore, thanks to our speakers, some of the aspects of the energy security, especially the ones related to the geopolitical standoff with Russia and the challenges that come from the energy transition, sector coupling, and digitalization of our energy grid. In order to allow the public to participate and make questions over these themes, at the end of every panel, we have a Q&A session. In order to make a question, we have two alternatives. The first one is passing through me. I'm called indeed question box. My function is gather questions through the chat. So the public can use the chat function that Zoom has. You just go down the window, open the chat, it's going to open in the right. Select as an interlocutor question box, write a question, specify the speaker towards the question is referred to, write your name and profession. And during the Q&A, I will read the question. Otherwise, it's possible to make a question by yourself, use the raise hand function that Zoom provides in order to catch the attention of our moderator that's going to give you the floor. Finally, I would like to spend a few words to the chair of this panel, Dr. Umbach. As I already said to him personally, it's difficult to imagine a person more suited to chair such a panel. The Dr. Umbach has an extensive experience, academic and professional, on energy security. He's currently the research director of the European Centre for Energy and Resource Security at the King's College of London, John Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Relations at the NTU of Singapore, Senior Associate at the Center of European Security Strategies in Munich, and many other posts that I will here just not mention, but in general, I think everyone should know. Dr. Umbach authored more than 500 publications in more than 30 countries. And in addition to his academic duties, he also worked as an advisor and consultant for many governments, including the Lithuanian one, the Polish one, the Hungarian, the US, the House of Lords of the UK, and so on. I really suggest you to just check online, and that's why we're so proud to have Dr. Umbach. I've had him as a visiting professor and today as the chair to this panel. So thank you, Dr. Umbach, and I'll leave you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, German. It's a great pleasure being here and to moderate this session, particularly as I'm also a visiting professor at St. Antolin College for some years. And actually, energy security has been the starting point, the determining factor of the EU's common energy policy, which actually started back in 2007, 1 year after the first Russian-Ukrainian gas supply crisis. So that was the impetus for the EU's common energy policy. And from that time, energy security, and particularly gas supply security, was very much in the center of the EU's common energy policies. And cynically, one can making the point that you can always rely on Mr. Putin by causing the next crisis back in 2010 and then 2014. So energy security until today, alongside of climate policies, have been the determining factor for the common EU energy policy. And in this context, of course, the completion of the internal market has been one of the also main strategic objectives, which is still relevant up until today. And within that context, again, overcoming the traditional energy islands have been another focus for more than 10 years in the EU's energy policies. And here again, the Baltic states are standing in the middle of the EU's attention. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Gianmarco Riva. He's a graduate student at the University of Bologna, and he has just returned from an institute of the University of Tartu. And his research interests very much center around energy geopolitics, security studies, EU-Russia relations. And he has also prepared for this webinar a very interesting paper, also using as for a study he wants to do on the Baltic states, energy dependence, positional energy dependence on Russia and how to overcome that. So I would really recommend everybody who's interested in these kind of topics also to read this paper. And I would give the floor immediately to Gianmarco, and I will then afterwards, after 10 minutes around, also introduce the second presentation by Robert. But please, Gianmarco, you have already the floor.
Thank you, Professor, for this bright introduction. It's a honor for me to be here today with you and with our colleagues and with all the people who decided to join this panel on the EU security challenges. And I had to start, I would like to express my gratitude to the College of Europe and to the amazing organizers of this event, which have been really trying their best shot to make sure that anyone here could get the most out of this today. So thank you very much. I'm here today to reflect with you about energy security, as Professor already mentioned. And I would like to do so by focusing on the process of energy diversification in the Baltic states. Because I think it's going to be interesting to offer you a better perspective about why these three countries do not seem to have, despite all the rhetoric, a cooperative tradition when it comes to address energy security challenges. And when I was trying to figure out how to start this presentation, I could not but think about why we are here today. And I believe this year is just not a good moment to take stock of the situation in the past decade of EU energy policies, as we are on the heels of the 10th anniversary of the Lisbon Treaty, but also to think about the Baltics region. And that's because this month we are about 10 years since a landmark event, which I think it radically shaped the entire energy landscape in the Baltics region. Indeed, it was in June 2009 when the first Memorandum of Understanding of the Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan, the so-called MEBIP initiative, was signed. This was intended to make, through a series of projects, the implementation of the Baltic energy markets and integration of it into the EU, thereby ending the isolation of their long-standing energy island status. Overall, we can affirm that, yes, I think that the MEBIP initiative has been a useful instrument as it favored the developments of the EU energy strategy for the Baltic Sea region, which now is, according to the Commission, one of the best interconnected in Europe, with an interconnectivity level of 23%, which is a good thing. But despite positive changes, I think that the process of integration of the Baltic states seems far from being accomplished. And surprisingly, although major energy crises, such as the two gas disputes between Kiev and Moscow, occurred in 2006 and then again in 2009, and the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, were generally perceived to indicate a convergence in the Baltic state perceptions toward Russia. Such a convergence is oddly absent in the energy field, which on the contrary results in a patchwork of national policies and endless debate about the optimal mix between unilateral or regional policies. So in this sense, arguments often arise about the actual methods of implementing the synchronization process. For example, the sense of extreme urgency that prevails in Lithuania over the issue is not much perceived in Latvia and Estonia, for instance, which have shown reluctance to join Vilnius, for example, on the Astravets issue, thus demonstrating that there remained divergency in national assessments of the threats posed by the eastern neighborhood. Peculiar here, I think that it's this example of Lithuania, which decided to move ahead in building the liquefied natural gas floating storage and regasification unit in Klaipėda due to the lack of progress in trilateral negotiations with its counterpartners. And overall, this lack of a coordinated approach toward energy security challenges, which was reinforced by diverging national priorities as a dual side effect. On the one hand, I think that it precludes the Baltic states from making more decisive progress away from Russia dependency, which in turn leaves greater room for Moscow in which to maneuver. And on the other hand, it exposes the inability of the energy union to fully implement a common European vision in energy policy. The same vision that we can find in, for example, the European energy strategy post-2014, according to which the union should be able to speak with one voice in external energy policy. So what reasons lie behind the lack of a common voice in the Baltic states? When I started to investigate the literature around the topic to find the answer to this, I found out that in general terms, there are many kind of factors sustained by a plurality of authors, which can be of internal and external nature, and both of them are mutually reinforcing. So someone relates to, for example, Russian energy assertive diplomacy toward the region. Some others refer to the EU increasing intervention approach after 2009, which focused more on emphasis on regional cooperation. Some others instead refer to internal factors such as different domestic energy mixes. But nevertheless, I think that there is a dimension from which such lack of cooperation seems to remain unexplored, and that's the way I decided to take down to follow, and that's the securitization point of view. I think that according to securitization logic, we can see that energy diversification process is perceived as a way to securitize the energy dependence on Russia of these three countries. And in this sense, Russia represents the main energy security threat for them, so much so that some scholars have even come to identify the three Baltic states as an interlinked identity, or to borrow from the words of Barry Buzan and Oli Weber, as a regional security complex. So this indicates that their security concerns are so closely interlinked one another that they cannot be understood separately. And in this sense, the securitization of the threat of, in this sense, energy dependence is valid for the whole group. But considering that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, upon about 2012, so when the process of energy diversification started to bear its fruits, share pretty much same factual level of energy dependence, which was about 90% of oil and 100% of gas on Russian sources. We might then have expected that the securitization process would have led to the same outcomes. But as I was trying to explain earlier, the reality has shown that this was not the case, with Lithuania being usually most vocal than the other two counterpartners in taking a step forward the diversification process. So in my research, the hypothesis is that actually the Baltic states cannot be considered a regional security complex. And that's because the perceptions of a threat, meaning energy dependence, is not perceived equally, thereby making the securitization process not valid for the whole group. So against this background, the aim of my research would be that to find out what led each state to or not to accept the energy dependence as a security threat, as a security issue. And my assumption here is that this depends on the type of their security frame which each state adopted. In this sense, energy security falls prey of subjective interpretation, as it can be understood differently in relation to the framework within which the notion is inscribed. So certain actors tend to adopt a security frame according to which the focus is on the reliability of the supplier, which comes to be more important than the price of the sources supplied. To the contrary, other actors tend to prevail economic considerations. So energy security in this sense is conceived more as affordability, meaning resources available at cheap prices. In the context of the Baltic states, I would assume that, seeing also the empirical evidence that I brought out so far, that Lithuania and Estonia tended to find themselves more prone to adopt a security frame as compared to Latvia, which seems to prioritize an economic interest. So in this sense, this is demonstrated, for instance, by, for example, Estonia and Latvia implementing their requirements of the gas directive straight away by adopting the most stringent unbundling measure toward Russia, as compared with Latvia, which procrastinated to do so. Or again, with Latvia intentions to import electricity from Belarus, even if it operates a nuclear power plant deemed unsafe, as a move to minimize the risk. And this is stark contrast with the reasons of Lithuania, which decided to oppose the projects because unsustainable, both in terms of political and economic dimensions. And once again, this, I think, brings, to bring things to a close before to leave the floor to Mr. Spanheimer, I would say that we can see that what remains is a mixture of ideational and structural terms, which is largely contribute to a rather uneven regional energy policy discourse. And in conclusion, the security studied approach, I think that is quite useful because it helps us to understand two things. First, that energy security is not an objective, but a socially constructed reality. And second, that consideration and perceptions of economic security frames are critical for comprehending and seeking to address energy security issues. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Gianmarco. That was excellent. Certainly using also the example of the Baltic states and highlighting the differences of perceptions, national interests, and policies is not constrained or not limited, of course, to the Baltic states. It's one of the living realities of the entire EU and its 27 member states, and why it's sometimes so difficult to reach a consensus, as we can just see it with the debates on the European Green Deal again. But we will come certainly back to your issue. Let me move directly to Robert Spanheimer, who is the head of energy at Bitkom, Germany's digital association. He was previously also an employee of the German Energy Agency and the German Foreign Office, and worked also as a project manager for a citizen energy company at Agrokraft. So he has a lot of practical experiences in various fields. And I'm very glad that he's giving a presentation on cybersecurity challenges and moving from robustness to resilience. As cybersecurity challenges, risks, and vulnerabilities of the critical energy infrastructures are still very much discussed outside of the EU's traditional understanding of energy security. So this is one of the major challenges the EU is facing, and from my point of view, having worked myself for more than 10 years in this field too, and having appealed that this issue needs to become an integral part of the EU's energy security concept, so that has not really taken place up to now. So also in terms of conceptualizing energy security, I think there's still a lot of changes we need to address and looking forward. And therefore, I'm very much glad that he's giving a presentation on this, from my point of view, very important rising topic of the EU's energy security of today and tomorrow. Please, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm just trying to share my presentation with you. Then we start right. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm really happy to participate as an alumni of Natolin. I was actually looking forward also to be in Poland, but the topic is nevertheless really important. As we will see, it's the link to Gianmarco's more classical approach to energy security is pretty close, as the threat is quite similar. If we look to the wake-up call for the cybersecurity threat in the power grid, it's actually been in 2015 the attack on the Ukrainian electricity supply. It is really an attack that has been prepared for years. It started off with the classical email attachment, and then the attackers could analyze the system from within for more than a year, and then they started the attack on the system, which led to large blackouts in all of Ukraine, and it's pretty sure that the attack came from the Russian side. Ukraine has actually, in some sense, been lucky that, as in most European states, the distribution grid is not really digitized yet. So they could simply build up their system in a classical way again. So the effect was pretty limited, but it gives a hint to what we might expect in a couple of years when we have a completely different energy supply. Well, in the classical view on energy supply, we concentrate still a lot on natural gas and oil, which is without any doubt very important, but we are in a transition towards a electrified energy supply. So this is what sector coupling means. We are changing to a power supply that is based on sun and wind. That's the backbone of the power generation. And electricity is also used in the mobility and heating sector. So any attack on the electricity sector has a huge impact in future. And at the same time, this change that comes with sector coupling means that we have many more actors in the grid that can be attacked. For example, to bring down a grid and to cause a blackout, you simply need to find a way to start loading electric cars at the same time. If you start this at the same time, you will bring down any power grid. This counts as much for electric heating. So as soon as you can control those new power consumers in a swarm, then you might cause really serious harm. This means the energy transition, meaning electrification and the sector coupling that comes with it, build up completely new possibilities to attack our electricity supply. And digitization is at the same time inevitable. We need to have many more actors and sensors in the system, which comes with the decentralized power generation and the many new consumers, which means we will, in the short distance future, we will have to have more autonomous running of distribution grids, which comes with one of those buzzwords, artificial intelligence. So this is the way we can control the complexity, but this brings many IT security questions with it. So we have a new threat, but at the same time, and this is why we have to deal with it right now, of course, it is also a way to gain more security, to have a better understanding of the possibilities of attack, and to have an early warning system and to get there. The EU understood the challenge. It was 2 years ago that the Cybersecurity Act has been passed, and now it's the time of implementation. So we are in this process, and we have to do it right. What I wanted to talk about, and I'm actually just presenting, I'm working for an association, and here on the right you can see a discussion paper we published in 2017 already, which is actually the topic I'm talking about. We moved on slightly, but not as much as we probably should have. It's a new understanding, it's a new concept. Right now, our power supply relies on the scheme of robustness. So every element of the supply system actually is redundant. There are two of them, so if one does not work, then another one can replace it. This won't work with all the new PV generation and all the new electric cars and electric heatings in the system. So you have to change a new concept, and that is what resilience means. It simply is a concept that accepts that we won't be able to avoid disturbances. It's a concept that prepares for those disturbances, which limits the damage, which automatically reacts to disturbances which do not necessarily need to be attacked from the outside. One also has to admit this. Any of you who uses IT systems knows that sometimes software is not perfect. So even with the digitization itself, there's the danger of disturbances. So we really have to implement new thinking in designing our grid. And I'm going to give you an example of one of our members. The name, you can see it down there on the left, is Office. It's a research, it's a practical or applied research institute for IT appliances, and they have a large research department for energy supply. And what they're doing, for example, is in laboratory tests. They're running two artificial intelligences next to each other to check where are the possibilities to attack a distribution grid. And this leads to pretty interesting new insights where the weaknesses of the system is. Of course, you cannot also implement AI too easily. You have to be cautious that not to avoid problems that might arise with the unfinished programming. And so this is still in the laboratory style, those tests, applied research, but it shows that this is the way you have to develop, because it's the only way to have autonomous distribution grids that will be able to tackle with those problems of the near future. So cyber resilient energy systems mean that we, of course, will preserve this the principle of robustness wherever possible. But for the rest of it, we have to think from the designing of power markets, of the implementation of smart grids, which means smart meter gateways, the digitalization of every house in the European Union. Actually, we have to implement artificial intelligence systems that identify risks and weaknesses, and build learning and adaptive systems to cover those threats in future. Well, this is just for a short overview of what those member companies are doing this applied research on, and I'm happy to discuss on the questions you might have.
Thank you very, very much, Robert. It was, I think, very, very interesting. Giving overview, not just what Bitkom is doing in respect to biosecurity, but it's across the whole spectrum of the industry, as well as of governments, which have increased the attention on those new issues. Let me begin by using the opportunity, raising one question to Gianmarco as well as to Robert. To Gianmarco, you have highlighted the Astravets nuclear power plant issue. And I remember some years ago when I participated at a conference in Lithuania, when I became known for the first time how important that issue had become at that time already. I was nonetheless struck there is, beyond the Baltic states and maybe Poland, not very much attention, obviously, in the EU on those issues. So I was wondering whether in your research, investigative research so far, you have come across some of the perceptions existing in Brussels or in major member states. I have to admit, here in Germany, the issue is hardly known at all, with the exception, of course, of some experts. Certainly the German Foreign Ministry is involved, but the issue itself has not attracted very much attention, despite the fact that the nuclear power plant is seen as very unsafe. There's a tremendous lack of transparency on the Russian side. And it goes up to the point where the Russian side has argued, yes, we will offer the EU and the Baltic states more transparency if you will sign a new electricity contract with us. But again, there doesn't seem very much attention beyond the Baltic states and Poland. So I was wondering whether you come across with any kind of attention perceptions existing in Brussels or, for example, also in your own country on the issue. I don't understand him.
Sorry, Gianmarco, your microphone doesn't work and we don't hear you.
Better now?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if I have to answer now or we have to wait for the questions for Robert.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I agree with what you say. I mean, I was quite surprised because I've been talking about this issue with kind of few of colleagues of mine from Italy, and also during my period of research in Tartu, I was talking with some guys from Poland and again from Sweden and Finland as well. And I was surprised by the fact that even in Finland or in Sweden, there is not that much attention to the issue, even though everyone's know also because of the International Energy Agency that reported that the nuclear power plant in Astravets is like completely against the international safety standards. It does not meet the requirements of the ESPO Convention, which is the conventions which assess the impact of transboundary effects of big energy projects. And despite all this, despite the fact that there are evidences of the fact that an eventual, hopefully not catastrophe, would have a transboundary effect, it seems that the only interested party is Lithuania, because it's like very close to the border with Belarus. Within the Brussels bubble, as they used to call it, I think that if the perception is not aware, is not raised in Brussels, it does depends kind of a lot on the member states' will to raise the issue within the Brussels framework. So to say, I think that in this sense, I would suggest like to raise more the issue, because it doesn't make enough just for Lithuanians' voice to be heard. But if like coming back to what I was telling about the lack of a regional understanding of regionalism, which may hamper the common voice of the EU, both in EU external and internal energy policies, this should be one of the opportunity to take advantage of, if some good fruit should be grasped at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, a question to Robert. When I began to work on cybersecurity, I was fortunate to become involved in the EU's first research project that was back in 2008 on cybersecurity challenges to the energy sector. And what we found out in the project was that the most vulnerable system, and that was obviously also the most dangerous one, was at that time seen to the SCADA systems, the supervisory and control systems, which are the nerve centers of every power plant. Yeah? And I remember that years ago, when I was talking with an engineer of ABM who's producing, for example, those kind of SCADA systems, is that making SCADA systems safe and secure is still a huge challenge for the companies producing the SCADA systems. Yeah? But as these are the nerve centers which are operating all the energy supplies of a power plant and grid system, are not really safe. You can, of course, try to make those SCADA systems as much as independent to the access of the internet as it's traditionally being done with nuclear power stations. But still, did you come across in your research how the situation looks now with the SCADA system? And maybe a second question is then related to the 5G, which is an issue I have worked over the last month and published some papers too, where I have the feeling that the new cybersecurity challenges of the 5G networks are not very well understood. Yeah? We operate here with public and political discussions and concepts which you could adapt to the previous 3 and 4G concepts, but the 5G is very much different when you analyze what is the core and what is the periphery. And given the overall importance of the 5G, far beyond the traditional 3 and 4G networks, I don't have a real impression that we really understand actually what the new technology we will introduce really mean in terms of new challenges. Please.
Okay. Well, the SCADA systems, we actually just discussed it last week in a web conference of our association. And well, those things that you heard or that happened still maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that suddenly you'd find access by the internet to a SCADA system because it was not protected from access from outside. That, fortunately enough, is not happening anymore today. This is certainly a progress in the sense of robustness that power plants now are really sealing off their critical IT infrastructure from outside. But still, one of the important, most important IT security measures is still the organizational precaution for personnel actually entering the critical IT infrastructure of a power plant. and thus you have a regulation that prescribes organizational measures that, for example, for really critical tasks, only 2 people at the same time can do this, and to run programs that teach the personnel for how those security attacks could look like. You really have to include all of the staff of any power plant or any power supplier. Concerning 5G, I think what few of us can imagine that the real impact of the Internet of Things that's going to be there, and it goes beyond the power sector, but it includes the power sector. We simply are going to have actors and sensors everywhere. So wherever we go, there's going to be information, and it's going to be able to control machines from remote. And this is going to be run by the 5G net. So this is going to be so critical for everyday life of every one of us that, of course, it has to be protected in a way that, especially attacks from state-funded hackers can really be excluded, or they cannot be excluded, but they can that we can defend ourselves against it. For example, in Germany, the smart meter gateways that are going to be introduced in the houses and that are going to be in every loading station of e-cars, they are going to be connected by the 5G net. So this is certainly one of the critical infrastructures, at least just as important as the power grid itself.
Okay. Thank you very much for those questions. I give it to German. Any questions coming from the audience? Also, maybe to other topics of energy security. If someone has certain kind of interest, please do not hesitate and use the opportunity to raise questions.
Yes, we got several questions. I'll take just the occasion this morning just to update the public on one change we had in the program. Unfortunately, due to technical limitations again by Zoom and the great interest in the networking session, we had to cancel it because it was really difficult to basically operationalize it. We're sorry. On the bright side, most of the speakers have agreed to share their contact details. So at the end of the conference, it would be possible to just directly reach out to speakers for any additional information or curiosity networking. So we hope that there won't be a huge problem for you and that you will still be able to meet our speakers and get in contact with them. So for what concerns the questions, we got 3 of them. I'll read all of them and the speakers will answer. 2 of them are for Gianmarco, and the last one is for Mr. Spanheimer. So the first one is from Uffe Kvidker, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, human resource consultant and board member of UN Association Denmark. It's for Gianmarco, and it's about EU-Russia relations. So considering the importance of the Baltic states and the energy policy in the Baltic states in the EU-Russia relations, is there a role in energy policy in the region in order to strengthen the EU-Russia dialogue, and in general, how to strengthen, according to your opinion, the EU-Russia dialogue? Second one comes from Lili Marchante, student from the University of Bologna. So same of Dr. Riva, and she asked, in the light of the challenges that the Baltic region faces in the energy policy. Is the EU doing enough to foster the Baltic's energy sector's resilience on Russia? And what else could be done? Finally, we have a question for Mr. Spanheimer. And what is the link between digital? It comes from Sebastian Jevet, student of law and political science at Sciences Po Bordeaux, and asks, what is the link between digitalization and critical infrastructures? And I leave the floor to our two speakers. Gianmarco can start.
Thank you, both of you, for these interesting questions. I think, if I may, to address both at the same time, because I think that kind of relates to the same fact. So on the one side, what can be done to better integrate and build a sense of so to say, reliability in the Baltics-Russia relations. And on the other hand, it refers to what else could be done in this sense by the EU to foster the Baltic resilience on Russia. So I think that regional cooperation in itself and energy integration in the Baltics may well play contribution in developing more diversified and integrated energy markets. But for this to be achieved, I think that some steps should be taken forward. Also with respect to the BEBIP initiative, which I think that has some shortcomings which necessitate to be addressed. For example, so the initiative, as far as I know, still lacks cooperation with the national energy strategy and does not guarantee a coherent energy development roadmap at a member state level. With respect to the perception of threats and the concept of energy security, I think that differences in threat perceptions should not represent a barrier for the development of practical cooperation, but instead the inclusion maybe of a roadmap, so to say, of Baltic energy cooperation within the Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan may be a good solution of how such divergences can be reconciled at the level of practical cooperation. And for its part, the EU should be allowed greater oversight on EU energy policy so that the needs of individual member states would be better taken into consideration. And here I connect again with the past questions of Professor concerning the Astrovets power plant. So better taking into consideration of the national interest when it comes to frame a regional policy. Because being the lack of awareness and understanding of regionalism and the interconnectedness on the other ends of the threats, limiting factor for inter-regional cooperation, both the three states and the EU are encouraged, I think, to carry out, for example, common threat assessments, as this might, I guess, well play a decisive role in raising regional awareness, which is an essential condition to advance the creation of a regional Baltic energy market. Okay. I hope that I answered to both questions, and I will be happy to expand the topic also in another settings if they would like to.
Yeah, thanks, Gianmarco. Please, Robert.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty good question on digitalization and critical infrastructures. Well, I think first we are entering into an era where everything is digitized. Everything is interconnected and connected. So first, well, we are digitizing critical infrastructures itself, like the power grid. So there's new attack scenarios. There is a possibility of denial of services attack. There's possibility of controlling swarms of electric heatings or cars that might bring down the power supply at time. And within a couple of days, we would have major problems if we cannot start the power supply again. I think the scenarios of a power cut for more than 2 days, unfortunately never happened in Europe these last years, but I think if you start thinking about it, then you can imagine that it simply affects every part of our life. So digitizing critical infrastructures is something critical, and the other thing is simply the connecting everything, and also having absolutely new computation capacities. So for example, if you talk about denial of services attack, which is, for example, the flooding of any infrastructures by senseless demands. One of the real thinkable threats is the attack of the intelligent light bulbs. If you are able to hack intelligent light bulbs that are all connected by Wi-Fi, then you can use their computational capacity, and simply because of its huge number, this is a capacity that could be used for attacking critical infrastructures. So this is actually the logic behind the EU Cybersecurity Act, simply to start with those little things that nobody thought about, like the light bulbs or the toothbrushes. But as soon as everything gets connected and everything is a small computer, then you can abuse it as well.
Perfect. I think Anna had raised the hands initially, so I would invite you if you have a question to one of the presenters.
There's also one other question from the public. So we can have an entire round. Plus the questions of Professor Herrann Surais. Francis Masson, one of our alumni, former academic assistant at NAFLI, asked for Mr. Mannheimer if you can elaborate on the cybersecurity aspect of the gas grid and all distribution systems in Europe. And then I leave the floor for Professor Herrann Surais.
Yes, thank you for wonderful presentations. And yeah, I had the question for each. My question to Gianmarco is a little bit of an academic question, but since this, you said that it's your master research, yeah, I thought that it was pertinent, because I think that your puzzle of why there is no cooperation among the Baltics is really nice, and your hypothesis that this is because there are different levels of securitization as well. But I was wondering whether using securitization somehow makes you look at the Baltic states as unitary actors. And if I think of Lithuania, also within Lithuania, there are differences between the center-right and the center-left on the extent to which energy cooperation with Russia is a good idea. There was a lot of public opposition to consider ways of diversification, for example, with a new nuclear power plant. So do you consider these differences? And yeah, whether that would lead you maybe to a different assessment. And shortly for Robert, there is lately a lot of concern in the EU with third country acquisition of critical infrastructures in the EU. And my question to you was whether you think that the fact that third country companies, state companies do acquire these, for example, energy grids or so, substantially increases the risk, or as you seem to suggest, well, this could happen anyway, a cyber attack remotely from anywhere. And do you think that these mechanisms that the EU is putting in place, such as this screening mechanism of foreign investment to prevent these acquisitions, is a useful tool, or generally your assessment on that?
Thank you, Hannah, for these questions. I didn't expect such a question, but I in the methodological part of my thesis, I kind of already wrote the answers, in the sense that I decided to focus just on the state actor, because according to the securitization theory as intended by the Copenhagen School, the act of securitizations is legitimized once it is brought up by the national security discourse. And in this sense, I decided to focus the attentions on the national security strategies of each Baltic states, so to identify the official position of the states within the region, and also with respect to the external actor, meaning Russia, in this sense, the Russian actor. And yeah, that's because I focus my attention on the state dimension. I hope it was clear. Thank you.
Robert?
Well, if it comes to the cybersecurity of the gas grid, it simply is different from the power sector, as it does not have this multiplication of actors as in the power grid. So it's much easier in a gas grid to seal off the critical IT infrastructure, because you don't have this these new production sites like PV plants or electric cars. So the difference to the new world of power supply is simply that you don't have this change. In about 20 years ago or 15 years ago, they used to be pretty much the same, gas grid or power grid. So you had to seal off from the outside, so then you would be pretty safe on the IT security side. But in the gas grid, you don't have this multiplication of attack scenarios. Concerning the third country acquisition of critical infrastructure, I think compared to the threats I described from that lie within the organizational structure, there might be a slight difference, but actually still the infrastructure stays within the reach of regulators and governments. I think it's not the real scenario for disaster. I think the threat is different. It can come from anywhere. As we used it, for example, also for the Iranian centrifuge. So we are using the possibility of IT attacks as Western states as well.
T'inquiète, ça va aller, hein?
Alexandra, please.
Hein?
Alexandra, you have your microphone.
Non, je disais à Victor que ça va aller, il se fait trop de soucis.
Could you, Alexandra, you have your mic on. Could you mute it?
Yeah.
I hear at the moment nothing.
Well, I answered the question as good as I could. So yeah.
Okay. In this case, I think I didn't get any additional questions. If there are, this is 1 minute left, so I don't know. But if someone wants, please. Otherwise, I think we can end with this. I hope, I mean, at least for me, very interesting panel. I hope also for all the rest of the public. I thank again our speakers, Gianmarco, Robert, our moderator, Dr. Umbach, and everyone, all of those that made some questions. As I already said, the networking session it's not going to be in place. So we're going to see each other tomorrow at 11 for the next panel of our conference. Thank you again.
Yeah, let me also thank all the participants, and particularly also the students who have organized this conference. And as I have myself organized so many conferences, I know how much work is standing behind that, which is not really known for those who have never organized the conference. And therefore, I would use the opportunity, maybe also in the name of our two presenters, but of everyone, really thanking the students of setting up the conference. And I think the large audience which wanted to participate, I think more than 160 participants registered before, are highlighting that the conference is already a big success, because nobody expected that so many people would attend the two-day conference. So thank you very, very much from my side. And of course, the two presenters for giving their insights and experiences. That was really highlighting the sessions, which I think offered for everyone a lot of insights and experiences. Thank you very much from my side again. Also to German, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you.
Okay. Bye-bye. All the best.